The message came through on a Tuesday afternoon, and it destroyed everything. I was sitting at my desk at work, mindlessly scrolling through emails when my phone buzzed with a text from a number I hadn't seen in 3 years. It was from Alina, my sister. My estranged sister, the one I hadn't spoken to since the fight that had torn our family apart. The one whose life I'd tried very hard to stop following on social media because seeing her happy without me hurt too much. The message was a photo. It was a wedding photo. Alina in a white dress, radiant and beautiful, standing next to a man I'd never seen before. Her arm was linked through his, and they were both laughing at something happening just outside the frame. She looked happy. Genuinely, completely happy. And underneath the photo, a single line of text. "You didn't come to my wedding. How could you?" I stared at that message for a long time, not moving, barely breathing, because the implication was clear. She was accusing me of intentionally skipping her wedding. She was acting as if I'd been invited and had chosen not to show up, as if I'd made a conscious decision to hurt her on one of the most important days of her life. And none of that was true. I hadn't been invited. I hadn't known there was a wedding. I hadn't known she was even in a serious relationship. The last thing I knew about Alina's life was from a brief Facebook scroll months ago where I'd seen her tagged in a photo at some kind of event, but I'd quickly closed the app because seeing her hurt too much. I called her immediately. The phone rang 5 times before she answered, and when she did, her voice was cold in a way I'd never heard it before. "What do you want?" she asked without preamble. "Alina, I don't know what you're talking about," I said, hearing the desperation in my own voice. "What wedding?" "When did you get married? I didn't even know you were." "Stop," she interrupted. "Just stop. I don't want to hear your excuses. I invited you. I sent you the invitation months ago, and you didn't even have the decency to respond. You didn't even send a message saying you weren't coming. You just ignored it." I felt my stomach drop. "Alina, I swear I didn't get an invitation. I didn't know about any wedding. If you sent something to me, I never received it." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When she spoke again, her voice was different, not less angry, but more confused. "You're lying," she said, but there was uncertainty in her tone now. "I have the list. I sent invitations to 47 people. I have records of everyone I invited, and your name was on that list." "Send it to me," I said. "Send me whatever proof you have, because I promise you I never got an invitation. I never knew about this wedding." The line went dead. She'd hung up. I sat at my desk for another long moment, then I got up and went to the bathroom. I locked the door and I cried. Not from anger, though there was anger. Not from hurt, though there was definitely hurt. But from the horrible realization that something was very wrong. That somehow a wedding had happened in my sister's life, a wedding that I'd never known about, and she was convinced that I'd been invited and had deliberately rejected her. The accusation made sense. Of course it did. In her mind, I'd chosen to skip her wedding. In her mind, I'd gotten an invitation and decided that my anger, my hurt, our estrangement, whatever it was more important than showing up for her on her wedding day. In her mind, I was the worst kind of person, but it wasn't true, and I had no way to prove it. That evening, I went home and I searched my email. I searched my spam folder, my trash, my archived messages. Nothing. No wedding invitation. No save the date. No message from Alina at all in the past 3 years. Just silence. The silence that had characterized our relationship since the fight. When I couldn't find anything electronically, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my mother. We'd maintained a strained but cordial relationship after the fight with Alina, though my mother clearly blamed me for the rift between her daughters. "Mom, did Alina send me a wedding invitation?" I asked without preamble. There was a pause. "Oh, honey," my mother said. "Yes, she sent it to your apartment. She said she wanted to make sure you got it in person, so she mailed it herself." My heart started beating very fast. When? When did she send it?" "About 4 months ago, I think. She mentioned it to me when she was over for Sunday dinner. She said she was nervous about inviting you because of everything that's happened, but she wanted to give you the chance to celebrate with her." I closed my eyes. "Mom, I never got it." "I haven't received any mail from Alina. I haven't received any wedding invitation." My mother's voice changed. "What do you mean you didn't get it? Rebecca, are you sure? Maybe you forgot." "I'm sure, Mom. I'm sure I would remember if my sister had sent me a wedding invitation." There was another long pause. "I believe you," my mother finally said quietly. "I believe you, but Alina is going to have a very hard time believing that." She was right. When I called Alina back and told her about the mailed invitation, she insisted that she'd sent it, that she'd been so careful about the address that she'd even written a note inside. "You probably threw it away without reading it," she accused. "You probably saw my handwriting and just tossed it in the trash." "Alina, why would I do that?" I asked, my voice breaking. Why would I throw away an invitation to your wedding without even opening it? Because you hate me, she said simply. Because you've hated me since the fight. Because you've made it clear that you want nothing to do with me or my life. And the terrible thing was, I understood why she thought that. I understood why she might believe I deliberately rejected her invitation. Because after the fight, I had shut her out. I had cut off contact. I had unfollowed her on social media and declined her attempts to reconcile. I had made it clear through my actions, or at least I'd made it clear through my inaction, that I wasn't ready to have a relationship with her. But I hadn't known about the wedding. I hadn't gotten the invitation. And now, the most important moment in her adult life had happened while I was absent, and she was convinced it was a deliberate choice on my part. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the conversation with Alina over and over in my head. I kept trying to figure out what could have happened to the invitation. Had it gotten lost in the mail? Had it been delivered to the wrong address? Had someone stolen it from my mailbox? All of these things seemed possible, but they all seemed unlikely. And none of them changed the fact that Alina now believed I deliberately hurt her, and I had no way to prove otherwise. The next morning, I did something I probably should have done immediately. I checked my mail more thoroughly. I went down to my building's mailroom and talked to the building manager, Derek, and asked if he'd seen any mail addressed to me that might have been misdelivered. Derek was sympathetic. He pulled up the delivery logs for the past 4 months, and we looked through them together. There was no record of anything from Alina being delivered to my address, but Derek suggested something that I hadn't considered. You know, he said, mail goes missing sometimes. People steal from mailboxes, or sometimes it gets delivered to the wrong building if the address is unclear. Have you checked with your neighbors? Someone might have accidentally gotten your mail. I thanked him, and then I did something I never would have thought to do in normal circumstances. I went door to door asking my neighbors if they'd received any mail addressed to me. Most of them hadn't seen anything. But on the 4th floor, Mrs. Chen from 4C answered her door and immediately said, "Oh yes, actually. I did get something for you a few months ago. I meant to bring it down, but I've been so busy with my granddaughter visiting. Let me see if I can find it." My heart was pounding as I waited outside her apartment. When she came back, she was holding an envelope. It was addressed to me in handwriting I recognized immediately. Alina's handwriting. The envelope was open. Mrs. Chen apologized profusely for opening it, explaining that she'd thought it was addressed to her initially, but the contents were intact. A wedding invitation. A beautiful, carefully designed wedding invitation with a handwritten note inside from Alina. The note read, "I know we haven't been close lately, and I know this is awkward, but I want you to be there. I want to share this day with my sister. I hope you can make it. Love, Alina." I stood in Mrs. Chen's doorway with the invitation in my hand, and I felt tears running down my face. I'd had an invitation all along. Alina had sent it to me, but it had been delivered to the wrong apartment, opened by Mrs. Chen, and Alina had had no way of knowing that I'd never received it. She'd assumed, when I didn't respond, that I was deliberately ignoring her. And by the time her wedding actually happened, she'd convinced herself that I'd rejected her intentionally. I thanked Mrs. Chen profusely and I went back to my apartment. I immediately called Alina. This time, when she answered, I could hear the coldness in her voice before she even spoke. "If you're calling to make excuses," she began. "I found it," I interrupted. "I found your invitation. It was delivered to the wrong apartment. Mrs. Chen from 4C got it by mistake and didn't realize it wasn't addressed to her. She opened it, and by the time she realized her mistake, she forgot to bring it down to me. I just found it this morning." There was silence on the other end of the line. "I'm holding it right now," I continued, my voice shaking. "Your invitation, your note, I never got it, Alina. I swear to you, I never got it. And if I had, I would have been there. I would have been at your wedding." Alina was crying now. I could hear it in the tremor of her breath. "I'm sorry," she said. "Rebecca, I'm so sorry. I should have called to confirm you were coming. I should have reached out differently. I should have." "It's okay," I said. "It's not your fault. How were you supposed to know?" "How am I supposed to know anything when we don't talk?" she asked, and now her crying was turning into sobs. "How are we supposed to have a relationship if we can't even get mail to each other properly?" She laughed through her tears, a slightly hysterical sound. "Do you realize how ridiculous this is? I've been angry at you for weeks because I thought you deliberately hurt me on my wedding day, and it turns out you didn't even know about my wedding." "I know," I said. I know how ridiculous it is, but Alina, I want to know about your wedding. I want to know about your husband. I want to know about your life, and I want you to know about mine." There was another pause. When Alina spoke again, her voice was smaller, more vulnerable than I'd heard it in years. "I miss you," she said. "I miss my sister." "I miss you too," I said, and I meant it. I meant it so much that it hurt. Over the next week, Alina and I talked every day. We talked about how we'd gotten to a point where we couldn't even talk to each other. We talked about the fight that had started it all, something petty and stupid that had escalated into something that had broken our family. We talked about the 3 years of silence and hurt, and we talked about her wedding. She told me about her husband, David, and how they'd met at graduate school. She told me about the ceremony and the reception and the honeymoon. She told me about the moment during the vows when she'd looked into the audience and expected to see me, and the hurt she'd felt when she realized I wasn't there. "I didn't understand how you could not come," she said. "You're my sister. You're supposed to be there." "I know," I said, "and I'm sorry. I'm sorry that I missed it. I'm sorry that you had to have that pain on your wedding day. If I had gotten that invitation." "I know you would have come," Alina said. "I know you would have been there. That's what I'm trying to tell you. I know now that it wasn't your fault. But at the time, I was so hurt and so angry and so convinced that you'd rejected me that I couldn't see any other possibility." We made plans to meet in person. It had been so long since we'd seen each other that I was nervous. What if things were too broken? What if talking on the phone had been easy compared to actually being face to face? But when Alina walked into the coffee shop where we'd agreed to meet, and I saw my sister for the first time in 3 years, all of that nervousness disappeared. She looked older, yes, but also somehow more herself. More settled. More at peace. We stood there looking at each other for a moment, and then she crossed the distance between us and pulled me into a hug. I held onto her like I was afraid she might disappear, and she held onto me just as tightly. "I'm sorry for thinking you didn't come on purpose," she whispered into my hair. "I'm sorry for blaming you. I'm sorry for shutting you out," I said. "I'm sorry for making it so easy to believe that I wouldn't be there for you." When we finally let go of each other, we were both crying. We sat down at a table and ordered coffee, and we started talking, really talking, for hours. About what had happened between us, about the fight, about why we'd let it go so far, about how we'd both been wrong and both been hurt and both had been too proud to reach out first. By the end of that day, we'd agreed on something important. Neither of us ever wanted to be in this position again. Neither of us ever wanted to assume the worst about the other. Neither of us ever wanted to let misunderstanding and hurt create the kind of distance that had separated us for 3 years. About a month after Alina and I reconciled, I asked her to tell me the whole story. About the wedding. About what she'd gone through. About the moment she'd sent me that wedding photo accusing me of not coming. Alina hesitated for a long time before she started talking. "The wedding was beautiful," she finally said. "David was everything I wanted him to be. His family was wonderful. The ceremony was perfect. But the whole time I kept looking for you in the crowd, and you weren't there." She took a sip of her coffee and continued. "I remember the moment I realized you weren't coming. We were about to start the ceremony, and my wedding planner was doing a final check of the guest list. I asked her if everyone had been accounted for, and she went through the list and said that you hadn't RSVP'd and hadn't shown up. At first, I just thought you were late. But as we got closer to the start time, I realized you weren't coming, that you just decided not to show up to my wedding." Alina's eyes filled with tears as she talked. "I was so angry, Rebecca. I was so hurt. I felt like you were rejecting me. Like you were saying that our fight was more important than our relationship as sisters. Like you didn't care about me or my happiness. And I went through the entire wedding feeling that anger. I smiled and said my vows and danced and celebrated, but underneath it all, I was furious with you. I can understand that," I said quietly. "I would have felt the same way if I'd been in your position. But that's the thing," Alina said. "You weren't in my position. You didn't do anything wrong. And I spent weeks after the wedding building this narrative in my head where you were the villain, where you deliberately hurt me, where you'd chosen not to come because you were cruel and heartless. And none of that was true." She looked at me directly. "I want you to understand how much time I wasted being angry at you for something you didn't do. How much energy I spent on this grudge that was based on a false premise. I let myself believe the worst about you, and it poisoned everything. And then when you showed up with proof that the invitation had never reached you, I realized how stupid I'd been. How I'd let my assumptions and my pain drive a wedge between us when we could have been there for each other all along. We talked about what this meant, about how easily we'd been separated by a simple logistical error, about how if Mrs. Chen hadn't gotten that invitation, if she'd simply thrown it away, Alina might still think that I'd rejected her, that our estrangement might have lasted for years, that we might have missed out on so much of each other's lives. I keep thinking, Alina said, about what would have happened if you hadn't gone door to door asking people about the mail. If you just accepted my accusation and moved on, we might never have fixed this. I know, I said. That's what I keep thinking too. This whole thing could have destroyed us permanently. But then Alina said something that made me reconsider the whole situation. Do you think maybe this needed to happen? She asked. Do you think maybe we needed this wake-up call? Because, Rebecca, we were already not talking to each other. We were already estranged. The missing invitation didn't cause that. It just made it visible. It made me confront what I'd already been feeling. She was right. I realized that I'd been so focused on the logistics of the missing invitation that I hadn't been thinking about the larger picture. Alina and I had already been separated by 3 years of silence. The wedding invitation hadn't caused that separation. It had just been the catalyst that finally forced us to address it. I think you're right, I said. I think we needed something to break the silence, because if we'd kept going the way we were, just not talking to each other, just existing in this state of wounded distance, we might have ended up like some families where 2 siblings stop speaking and it lasts for the rest of their lives. Alina nodded. I've seen that happen, she said. I've seen people let hurt calcify into permanent distance. And I don't want that to be us. We made a commitment to each other that day. We committed to talking regularly. We committed to being honest with each other about our feelings instead of letting them fester. We committed to assuming the best about each other instead of the worst. And we committed to never letting a simple misunderstanding become an excuse to distance ourselves. Over the next few months, Alina and I worked on rebuilding our relationship. We introduced each other to people we cared about. Alina invited me to family dinners with David's family. I invited her to work events. We started having weekly phone calls where we'd catch up on everything. And slowly, gradually, I started to feel like we were truly sisters again. Like we'd moved past not just the wedding incident, but the years of estrangement that had preceded it. One day, about 6 months after we'd reunited, Alina said something to me that I'll never forget. We were sitting on her couch looking through old photos from before the fight when we'd still been close. You know what the craziest part of this whole thing is? She asked. The craziest part is that I was so convinced I was right. I was so sure you deliberately hurt me that I didn't even stop to consider any other possibility. I didn't ask questions. I didn't try to understand your side. I just assumed the worst and made a story out of it. I would have done the same thing, I said. I probably have done the same thing to you in different ways. That's what I mean, Alina said. We're so quick to believe the worst about each other. Even after being sisters for 30 years, we're so ready to think that the other person is intentionally hurting us. And it's such a waste. It's such a waste of time and connection and love. I didn't have an answer for her, but I thought about how much time we'd already wasted. 3 years of silence. Weeks of her thinking, I deliberately skipped her wedding. All the moments we'd missed together. All the memories we could have made but didn't. All of that waste because of a simple misunderstanding and our willingness to believe the worst about each other. A year after Alina sent me that wedding photo accusing me of not coming, I decided to do something that I'd been thinking about for months. I decided to go back and look at the original fight, the thing that had started everything. Because I realized that if I was going to have a real relationship with my sister, I needed to understand not just the wedding incident, but what had caused the years of silence that preceded it. So one evening, I called Alina and I asked her if we could finally talk about the fight, about what had happened, about why we'd let it tear us apart so completely. Alina was quiet for a long time. I didn't think you wanted to talk about it, she finally said. I thought you wanted to just move forward and pretend it never happened. I don't think we can move forward until we understand what happened, I said. I don't think we can really heal unless we address the original wound. So we sat on the phone, both of us on our respective couches in our respective apartments, and we finally talked about the fight, about the stupid, petty thing that had started it, about how we'd both said things we didn't mean, about how those things had hurt so much that we'd both decided it was easier to just stop talking than to try to work through the pain. Alina started crying as she talked about what she'd said. I told you that you'd always been selfish, she said. I told you that you'd never been a good sister. I told you that I wasn't surprised that you'd ended up alone because nobody could stand to be around you. I listened to my sister confess to saying these things, and I remembered the pain of hearing them. I remembered how much they'd hurt, but I also remembered what I'd said back to her. I told you that you were jealous of me, I said. I told you that you'd never been happy for my success. I told you that you were a terrible person and that I was glad we weren't going to have to spend time together anymore. Alina's crying intensified. We said such horrible things, she said. Things that were designed to hurt as much as possible. How did we get from being sisters to saying things like that to each other? I don't know, I said. But I do know that I didn't mean those things. And I don't think you meant them either. I think we were just so angry and so hurt that we wanted to hurt back. We talked for hours that night. We talked about the things that had been building up between us before the fight, about the small resentments and the unspoken hurt, about the ways we'd been growing apart even before the final blow-up. And we talked about what had kept us apart after the fight, about how pride had kept us from reaching out first, about how the longer the silence went on, the harder it became to break it. By the end of the conversation, we'd said things that needed to be said. We'd apologized. Not just for the fight itself, but for all the years of silence that had followed. We'd acknowledged that we'd both made mistakes, that we'd both been wrong in different ways, that we'd both been hurt and had responded to that hurt in ways that only made things worse. I want to do something, Alina said after we talked for hours. I want to have a do-over wedding. I want to have a ceremony where you're actually there. I don't care if it's a renewal of vows or a party or whatever. I just want to mark the moment when we came back to each other. I want it to be as meaningful as my first wedding, but for different reasons. I was shocked by this suggestion. Alina, I don't know what to say. Say yes, Alina said. Say you'll be there. Say you'll be my bridesmaid this time instead of absent. Say you'll be my sister the way you were supposed to be at the first wedding. So that's what we did. 3 months later, Alina and David had a small renewal ceremony. It wasn't a traditional wedding. It was just a small gathering of close family and friends. Alina wore a simple white dress, not as elaborate as her original wedding dress. David wore a suit, and I stood beside my sister as she renewed her vows, as she promised again to love and cherish David, but also with the understanding that this ceremony meant something different now. This ceremony was about reconciliation. This ceremony was about two sisters choosing to come back to each other. During the ceremony, Alina said something that I think was the most important part. She looked directly at me as she was speaking to David, and she said, "And I promise to never let misunderstanding come between me and the people I love. I promise to ask questions instead of making assumptions. I promise to believe in the goodness of the people I care about, even when I'm hurt." She looked directly at me when she said this, and I understood that this wasn't just about David. This was about me too. This was about her commitment to our relationship. This was about her promise that she would never again let a simple mistake create an estrangement. After the ceremony, we had a small reception, and at one point, Alina pulled me aside and gave me something. It was the original invitation that Mrs. Chen had accidentally opened, the one that had never reached me on the first go-around. Alina had framed it. "I did this a while ago," she said. "I wanted to remember what it felt like to almost lose you. I wanted to remember that sometimes things go wrong through no one's fault. And I wanted to remember that when they do go wrong, we have a choice. We can let it destroy us, or we can let it teach us something." We looked at the framed invitation together, and I felt grateful. Grateful that the invitation had gotten delivered to the wrong apartment. Grateful that it had been opened by mistake. Grateful that these accidents had forced us to confront what had already been broken between us and finally fix it. What if Mrs. Chen had thrown the invitation away instead of keeping it? I asked Alina. What if we'd never found it? Alina was quiet for a long moment. "Then I think we would have stayed apart," she finally said. "I think we would have let this misunderstanding become permanent. I think we would have let a simple accident destroy our relationship." "So in a weird way," I said slowly, "we should be grateful that everything went wrong." Alina smiled and squeezed my hand. "I think we should be grateful that we had another chance," she said. "I think we should be grateful that this whole thing forced us to finally address what had been broken between us. And I think we should never, ever let something that small create that much distance again." After the renewal ceremony, Alina and I became closer than we'd ever been, even before the fight. There was something about having gone through that estrangement and come out the other side that created a bond between us that hadn't existed before. We'd proven to each other that we were willing to fight for the relationship. that we were willing to work through hurt and misunderstanding, that we could survive even significant distance and come back to each other. We also started being more intentional about how we communicated. We made sure to reach out regularly. We checked in not just about the big things, but about the small things, the daily frustrations and joys that make up a life. We sent photos and videos and voice messages. We scheduled regular phone calls and video chats. And we were always asking questions instead of making assumptions. About a year after the renewal ceremony, Alina called me with news. "Pregnant," she said without preamble. My first reaction was excitement. My second reaction was something else. I remembered the wedding. I remembered the accusation. I remembered the feeling of being blamed for something I hadn't done. And I thought about Sophie, David's daughter from a previous relationship. I thought about the complicated family that Alina was creating. I thought about everything that could go wrong. But I pushed that aside and I focused on the present moment. "Alina, that's amazing." I said, "Congratulations, I'm so happy for you," she laughed. "Are you really? Because I know you probably have about 1,000 questions and concerns running through your mind right now." She knew me so well. "Of course I have questions," I said, "but they're not because I don't support you. They're just because I care about you and I want to make sure you're okay." "I know," she said. "That's why I called you first. That's why you're the first person I wanted to tell. Because I know that whatever happens with this pregnancy and this baby, you're going to be there for me. You're going to be my sister, no matter what." Over the next several months, I was indeed there for Alina. I went with her to doctor's appointments. I listened to her complain about morning sickness and cravings. I helped her plan the nursery. I was her birthing coach when she decided to give birth naturally. And when her son was born, a beautiful baby boy named Michael, I was there in the hospital room. I held his tiny hand and looked at his perfect face, and I thought about how close we'd come to missing this moment. If Alina had decided that I'd intentionally hurt her and had cut me out of her life completely, I never would have been in that hospital room. I never would have met my nephew. I never would have been part of this moment that was so important to my sister's life. 3 years after Michael was born, Alina asked me to be his godmother. She sat me down and she said, "I want to ask you to be Michael's godmother, not just because you're my sister, but because you've shown me what it means to fight for a relationship. You've shown me that you're willing to overcome obstacles and hurt and misunderstanding to be there for the people you love. And I want Michael to have that example in his life. I want him to know his Aunt Rebecca, the woman who got a wedding accusation and instead of getting angry and walking away, got curious and figured out the truth." I was crying as she talked, and I said yes immediately. "I would be honored," I said. "I love that boy so much already." The day of Michael's christening, I stood with him in the church, and I thought about how much my relationship with Alina had changed. How much our whole lives had changed because of a simple logistical error. A wedding invitation that got delivered to the wrong apartment. An accusation that turned out to be based on a misunderstanding. But also, how that misunderstanding had led us to address all the underlying hurt and estrangement that had been the real problem. How it had forced us to have the conversations that we should have been having years ago. How it had brought us back to each other and made us stronger. After the christening, Alina pulled me aside. "I want you to know something," she said. "That photo I sent you, that wedding photo where I accused you of not coming, I wanted to delete it after we reconciled. I wanted to pretend like that moment never happened, but I decided to keep it. I wanted to keep it as a reminder of how quick I was to believe the worst about you, as a reminder of how important it is to communicate, as a reminder that sometimes the things that seem like betrayals are actually just misunderstandings." She showed me the photo on her phone. She had printed it and hung it in her house, in a place where she would see it regularly. "That's my commitment reminder," she said. "That's my way of making sure I never let that kind of distance grow between us again." I looked at the photo, Alina on her wedding day, radiant and happy, unaware that in the hours after this photo was taken, she would send me an accusation that would reveal just how thin the thread between connection and estrangement really was. And I understood why she kept it. Why she looked at it regularly. Why she wanted to remember that moment. Because that moment had almost cost her everything. And by some grace of misdelivered mail and a kind neighbor and the willingness of two sisters to keep trying, she hadn't lost it. She'd gotten her sister back. And in the process, she'd become a better version of herself. Someone more compassionate. Someone more willing to question her assumptions. Someone more committed to the people she loved. Several years after Michael's birth, I decided to write about what had happened. I wasn't sure if I was doing it for Alina or for myself or for some larger purpose, but I felt like I needed to document the story. I needed to process it and understand it more deeply. So I sat down and I wrote the whole thing out. The accusation, the missing invitation, the reconciliation, the conversations about the original fight, the renewal ceremony, Michael's birth, all of it. I wrote about the choices we'd made and the choices that had been made for us by circumstance. I wrote about how a simple misunderstanding had almost destroyed our relationship and how that same misunderstanding had ultimately saved it. And then I showed it to Alina. I told her I wanted to share it, maybe with a wider audience, and I wanted to know if she was comfortable with that. She read it in one sitting, and when she was done, she had tears streaming down her face. "I want to share this," she said immediately. "I want people to know about this. I want people to understand how easy it is to lose someone you love, how easy it is to let assumptions and hurt create distance. And I want them to understand that it's also possible to come back from that. It's possible to rebuild. It's possible to choose connection even when it's hard." So I shared the story. I published it in a magazine, and the response was overwhelming. People reached out to tell me about their own estrangements, about their own families that had been torn apart by misunderstandings, about sisters and brothers and parents and children who weren't talking to each other because of hurts that had been allowed to calcify into permanent distance. Some people told me that reading the story had made them reach out to someone they hadn't spoken to in years. Others told me that it had helped them understand why their own relationships had fractured. And many people told me that it had given them hope that maybe, if they were willing to try, they could rebuild those relationships too. Alina told me that she'd heard from people at her church, and through her work who'd read the story and recognized themselves in it. People who'd been holding onto grudges for years. People who'd been waiting for the other person to reach out first and didn't realize that they could be the one to make the first move. "This story is helping people," Alina said to me. "Our story is helping people save their relationships." I was grateful for that. I was grateful that something that had been painful and confusing and almost destructive had turned into something that could help others. But mostly, I was grateful for my sister. I was grateful that she'd been willing to take a risk on me when I came to her with proof that I hadn't deliberately hurt her. I was grateful that she'd been willing to examine her own assumptions and admit when she was wrong. I was grateful that she'd been willing to work through years of hurt to get back to each other. 10 years after Alina first accused me of not coming to her wedding, she called me on the anniversary of the day we'd reconciled. "Do you remember what day this is?" she asked. "It's the day I sent you that wedding photo," I said. "It's the day you accused me of not coming. It's also the day that changed everything," she said. "I want to mark the anniversary. I want to do something to celebrate the fact that we found each other again, that we didn't let the misunderstanding destroy us." So we decided to meet for dinner. Just the two of us at the restaurant where we'd had our first real conversation after reconciling. When we got there, the waitress recognized us. Apparently, we came to this restaurant with some regularity, and this particular waitress had become something of a friend to both of us over the years. "Table for two?" she asked as she led us to a familiar booth. "Same as always." "Same as always," Alina confirmed. As we sat down and opened our menus, I looked across the table at my sister. She was older than she'd been 10 years ago. We both were. There were more lines on her face, more gray in her hair, but there was also more peace. More contentment, more of a sense that she'd lived a full life and didn't regret any of it. "I want to tell you something," Alina said, setting down her menu. "I want to tell you that I'm sorry. Not for the original fight. We've both apologized for that 100 times. And not for the accusation at the wedding. We've worked through that. But I'm sorry for all the years before that. I'm sorry that we were drifting apart so gradually that neither of us even noticed until it was almost too late. I'm sorry that I let our relationship get to a point where a simple misunderstanding could almost destroy it completely. I'm sorry too," I said. "I'm sorry that I shut you out after the fight. I'm sorry that I made it so easy for you to believe the worst about me. I'm sorry that it took losing you to make me understand how much I needed my sister in my life." Alina reached across the table and took my hand. "But I'm grateful," she said. "I'm grateful that we figured it out. I'm grateful that you went door to door asking for the mail. I'm grateful that Mrs. Chen had delivered that invitation to her apartment. I'm grateful that all of these things that could have just been coincidences instead became the catalyst for us finding each other again." "Me too," I said. "Me too." We ordered dinner and we talked like we always did. We caught up on work and life and family. We laughed about things and cried about things and just existed together in the way that only two sisters who have been through something can exist together. And at the end of the night, Alina pulled out her phone and showed me something. It was a photo of the two of us, taken earlier in the evening at the restaurant. We were both smiling at the camera, our heads closed together, looking exactly like what we were. Two sisters who'd almost lost each other but had found their way back. I want to remember this, Alina said. I want to remember that we made it, that we survived the misunderstanding and the hurt and the years of estrangement, and we came out the other side stronger. She sent the photo to me, and I set it as my phone's lock screen. Every time I picked up my phone, I would see that photo. I would see my sister's face and remember everything we'd been through. And I would remember that sometimes, the things that threaten to destroy us can actually become the things that save us. Sometimes, the worst moments of our lives can become the most important moments. Sometimes, a simple misunderstanding can lead to understanding in the deepest sense. And sometimes, all it takes is one person being willing to ask questions instead of making assumptions. One person being willing to look deeper. One person being willing to fight for the connection. And everything changes. Years passed, and Alina and I became not just sisters but each other's best friends. We had inside jokes that stretched back decades. We could finish each other's sentences. We understood each other in the way that only people who'd known each other their entire lives could understand. But more importantly, we understood the fragility of connection. We understood how easily relationships could fracture. And we understood how important it was to fight to keep them intact. Alina eventually opened up to me about something she'd never fully articulated before. She told me that the wedding accusation had shaken her belief in her own judgment. I was so convinced that you'd rejected me, she said. I was so certain that I was reading the situation correctly, and I was completely wrong. It made me question everything about how I understand other people's motivations. It made me realize how much my own hurt was coloring my perception of reality. I understood what she meant, because I'd gone through a similar thing. I'd had to question my own instinct that Alina would immediately believe me when I explained about the misdelivered invitation. I'd had to confront my own assumptions about why we'd ended up so estranged in the first place. The wedding incident had been a mirror held up to both of us, forcing us to see ourselves more clearly than we might have otherwise wanted to see. Do you think we would have figured it out without the wedding? I asked Alina one day. If you'd never sent that accusation, if we just kept drifting apart, do you think we would have eventually reconnected? Alina was quiet for a long time. Honestly, I don't think so, she finally said. I think we would have kept drifting. I think the distance would have become permanent. I think eventually, we would have become the kind of sisters who saw each other at family gatherings and were polite to each other but weren't actually close. And I think we both would have spent our entire lives regretting that. So the wedding incident saved us, I said. The worst moment between us ended up being the moment that rescued our relationship. I know it sounds backward, Alina said, but I think that's true. I think that accusation was the wake-up call that we both needed. It was the moment that made us understand what we were losing if we didn't do something. When Michael turned 10, Alina decided to tell him the full story of how his mother and his aunt had almost lost each other. She thought it was important for him to understand what the framed wedding invitation in their hallway represented. She thought it was important for him to know that relationships required work and intention, that they could break, but that they could also heal if you were willing to do the work. I was there when she told him the story. I watched his face as he learned about the accusation, the missing invitation, the reconciliation. And I saw him grow to understand something that many adults never learned, that love wasn't just a feeling. It was a choice. It was something you had to fight for. It was something that could be fragile and resilient at the same time. So you guys almost didn't have a relationship, Michael said after Alina finished the story. Because of a male error. Because of a male error and because we let our hurt and pride get in the way, Alina corrected gently. But yes, we almost lost each other because of something so simple, so fixable, and it took us asking questions and being willing to listen to each other to figure it out. That's wild, Michael said. So I exist because of a mail delivery error. In a way, yes, I said, and we all laughed. Michael grew up with a healthy respect for the fragility of human connection. He grew up knowing that relationships required maintenance. He grew up understanding that misunderstandings were human and inevitable, but that they didn't have to be permanent. And most importantly, he grew up with two women in his life who were committed to showing him that it was possible to hurt each other and then heal. That it was possible to be estranged and come back. That love was worth fighting for. When I was 50 years old, I received a package in the mail from Alina. Inside was a photo album. It was filled with photos of our life together over the past 20 years. Photos from family gatherings. Photos from the renewal ceremony. Photos from Michael's birth and baptism and various milestones. Photos of the two of us at restaurants, at beaches, at mountains. A visual chronicle of everything we'd rebuilt together. But the first photo in the album was the wedding photo. The photo that Alina had sent me with the accusation. The photo that had almost cost us everything. And underneath it, Alina had written, "This is where it started. This is where I almost lost you. But because we were brave enough to ask questions, because we were willing to listen to each other, because we were committed to our relationship, we didn't lose each other. Instead, we found each other again. And all of these photos that follow are proof of what we built out of that wreckage. This is the story of two sisters. This is the story of how we broke. This is the story of how we healed. And this is the story of how we learned that love is strong enough to survive almost anything, as long as we're willing to fight for it." I sit with that album now, and I think about the day that Alina sent me that wedding photo with the accusation. I think about how that one message almost destroyed everything. I think about how easily I could have gotten angry and defensive. How easily I could have decided that Alina was toxic and cut her out of my life. How easily we could have let that moment define our entire relationship. But instead, we chose differently. We chose to ask questions. We chose to listen. We chose to fight for each other. And in choosing all of those things, we became not just sisters, but partners in each other's lives, advocates for each other, champions of each other's dreams and happiness. The album sits on my shelf now, a physical representation of what we've built. And every time I look at it, I remember that wedding photo. I remember that accusation. I remember the missing invitation. And I'm grateful. Grateful that things went wrong in just the right way. Grateful that we were willing to fix it. Grateful that I have my sister. Because in the end, that's all that matters. Not the perfect beginning, not the flawless communication, but the willingness to keep trying, even when everything feels broken. Even when misunderstanding threatens to tear us apart. Even when the easiest thing would be to give up. Because sisters are worth fighting for. Love is worth fighting for. And sometimes, the best relationships are the ones that have survived the worst moments and come out the other side stronger.